I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to you for choosing to invest a little of your time on this particular journey of thought. At whatever stage you watch this presentation, I really hope that something in its contents speaks to you. I also wish to thank the organizers of this conference for their leadership, their forbearance, and for accepting this proposal. Perhaps it is important to offer a framework for what follows. I cannot possibly be described at this time as a prototypical early music researcher. Indeed, I am best described in this environment as not much more than a Baroque music enthusiast. However, there are a significant number of historical touchstones in my life that have contributed to the journey leading to the point where this presentation is being recorded for Birmingham Biennial Baroque 2021. My experience within multiple Black communities of the English-speaking territories of both North and South is that when it comes to Western art music, which will forever remain classical music in the vernacular, we have unstintingly and enthusiastically bought into the lexical and conceptual ideologies that see the historical period we still characterize as the classical era as the epitome of perfection in this particular musical and cultural vanguard. Whether in the Caribbean, the UK, or the US, despite an acknowledgement that classical music started prior to the classical era, historically, we've placed Mozart on a pedestal, and both Haydn and Beethoven are taken to be inferior. Although some will grant that Haydn's creation is a work of genius, and Beethoven's Emperor Concerto has tended to be of more interest to many Black classical music lovers than his Fifth Symphony. The last century is very exciting to some of us, and for the majority of people in this audience constituency, 20th century composers who maintain what we take to be an accessible relationship to tonality can also be enjoyed. One consequence of this is that I arrived as an undergraduate classical pianist at music college with absolutely no knowledge of anything earlier than Clementi and no sense that this was a problem. To this day, the best known and most popular Black classical musicians, not least with Black classical music audiences, are still not known for their investment into repertoire predating Clementi. Somewhere in all this, there is a vague notion that Handel might possibly belong to an era earlier than Mozart. But Black classical music audiences are far from the audience constituencies who take whatever aesthetic appreciation they take from Messiah without any interest or connection to the wider context that is Baroque music. I had long abandoned my involvement in classical music when I was invited to attend a liturgical performance of Bach's St. John Passion in English at St. Paul's Cathedral back in 2005. I knew at the time that this was a life-changing experience, but it is only with hindsight that I am appreciating just how life-changing this event was. Because I do possess confessional Christian faith, I was very connected to the principle that a liturgical performance could not be monetized, but I had never personally experienced a performance like this. However, what completely threw my gaskets out of joint was the fact that there was no applause whatsoever throughout the whole performance. This was in stark contrast to the performative practices in gospel churches, where a particularly exciting chord from the Hammond organist, a drum fill, a vocal riff, or just one single high note is often enough to induce a whole barrage of applause and cheers and whistles from the listeners, who essentially demand to be entertained in church just as they would expect to be entertained in a paid concert event. Notwithstanding the interval, for 118 minutes, I was completely absorbed in both the music itself and the manner in which it was being performed. That single event changed many of the ways in which I thought about music, full stop, including how I wanted to write and perform sacred music. But at no stage did I ever believe I would actually get to conduct that same work myself, until a sequence of events took me to the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama to study choral conducting. In the second week, we began to work on some of the Bach motets, and very quickly I realized that this music mattered to me just as much as gospel music and jazz. But of course, I was now in an environment where the Johannes Passion was taken to be a singularly important example of a Gesamtkunstwerk, irrespective of whether or not the actual word was ever used by a given performing cast. And I was also about to learn that the question of authentic performance dominates the whole milieu of early music in significantly different ways to that of later eras in Western art music. Early this calendar year, the Australian musicologist and violinist David Irving presented a coruscating paper at Royal Holloway on decolonizing historical performance practice. And one of the many bombshells he dropped was the idea that what is now taken to be truly authentic performance practiced within historical performance is in fact racist. This assertion did correspond to the general trajectory of his paper, but I have it on quite outstanding authority that an actual argument for this position will be found in the pages of his forthcoming monograph for the University of Michigan Press, due next year. Irving also drew attention to the research that his fellow Antipodean, Karulatha Mani, has been undertaking with regard to how her identity as a vocalist of South Asian heritage, who is a specialist performer of Carnatic music, can in fact be brought to bear on the performance of Seconda Pratica. Let's take a look.
Sospirar, sospirasti. Felicissimo il punto che la candida mano degno di pura fede a me porgesti.
பிரியாதே கண்ணா என்றும் நான் உந்தன் சொல்லும் நீங்காது இருந்த பந்தம் வீணாதம் நான்
Part of what makes this musical moment particularly important is the fact that it reverses the polarity of what we have come to expect as the usual starting point for hybrid enterprises such as this. Mani comes to the Baroque oeuvre from an ethnic, cultural, and epistemological identity that is emblematic of what we are now calling the Global South, and discovers a way to think in music encapsulated within not merely the basic sonic embodiment of Monteverdi's music per se, but also the rhetorical and affective dimensions of the Seconda Pratica, not least with regard to the ways in which this practice is understood to represent an emancipation from the very specific and arduous circumscriptions of Prima Pratica, particularly with regard to what is somehow not yet quite harmony, but certainly is dissonance as well as counterpoint. Certain sets of airs will struggle to make the connections when the melismatic singing based on ragas are imbricated with what are as yet fairly conventional keyboard realizations of Monteverdi's figured bass. Some of those sets of airs will be familiar with the types of hybridities developed by improvising jazz musicians collaborating with performers who work outside Western music theory. One of my favorite examples is the way in which the oud player Anwar Brahim has worked with the saxophonist John Sermon and the double bass player Dave Holland to blend music making within the traditions of Maqam and the jazz approach to Western music theory. On that occasion, aspects of the specificities of Maqam shaped the approach to melody and harmony taken by the two Western musicians. Another outstanding example is this collaboration by John McLaughlin and Trida Gertu, in which the musical language espoused and both composition and improvisation is conceived to result in products and processes in which East and West do actually become symbolically unified, or the symbiotically unified, both. In both the examples I've just cited, all of the musicians involved made it their business to ensure that they were sufficiently familiar with all of the musical traditions being leveraged. Of course, a cynic will argue that at that level of professional music making, there's exponentially more time and space for those sorts of explorations than may have been possible for the musicians involved in Mani's project. That is, of course, correct. And so these observations are not in any way intended as criticisms. But this does not mean to say that it would not be ideal to hope that as Mani continues this important work, she will be able to work with instrumentalists who are able to invest much more into understanding Carnatic music, and thus be able to contribute to a more comprehensive symbiosis of the type we experience with Jordi Saval's incredible project entitled The Roots of Slavery, that is perhaps the current preeminent example of an outward-looking hybrid project that starts from Europe. In Saval's own words, I start with the music I know, and then at depth by historical research. In this case, the story starts with the first mass captures in 1444, with the King of Spain sending slaves to work for him in the gold mines. To shed light on this history, I asked myself, what music was played at the time? What music is played today by the descendants of those slaves? Of course, it's impossible to know exactly what those people sung in 1444. On the colonial side, we have notated music starting from around 1600, but for the music from an oral tradition, we've had to make compromises in order to impart a certain atmosphere to the project as a whole. In some cases, I have even chosen to insert new music composed within the tradition. In previous early music projects, Saval and his ensembles had explored music of the colonial era in the Americas under Spanish rule. Saval became aware of the powerful influence from African traditions on secular and religious songs in the New World. He realized that they were performing music that had been brought over by the slaves, but from the perspective of the church and the enslaving powers. Saval wanted to understand more about how the music traditions of these enslaved peoples have been preserved among descendants in Central and South America. He also became curious about how musical cultures in Africa are interconnected through these musical traditions. Two areas especially rich in examples are presented in the roots to slavery. Mali was one of the most important empires in Africa in the Middle Ages, and several Malian performers take part in the performance, including Balake Sissoko, who is a virtuoso on the kora, which is a type of harp lute. I have met very, very few people who know that Madagascar has a history of slavery on the east coast of the African continent, so Saval really has done their homework. And the Malagasy musician Rajeri plays the valiha, which is Madagascar's signature bamboo tube zither, on this project. Structurally, Saval composed the program as a sequence of instrumental and vocal pieces interspersed with narrated texts drawn from contemporaneous documents relating to the development of the slave trade, such as a grim extract from the Slave Code of Barbados and reflections by the philosopher Montesquieu on the topic of slavery. Other examples include texts from Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and a slave named Belinda, who petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for a pension. And as you can see, Monica Rojas Stewart has observed that there are some challenges with a project like this because the narrated script conveys a white colonial perspective, which does put the focus on victimization. But at the same time, she notes that Saval has done impressive archival research, and basically she's excited about people going to see this project live. When I first heard the Laxime, South American Baroque, I was a young man at the start of my adult life, and like many people at that stage, the fact that I had battled to overcome a conspicuous amount of obstacles through my childhood meant that I thought I knew and understood more than I did. On the basis of considerably more knowledge than some, but spectacularly less knowledge than others, I assumed that somehow the Baroque oeuvre had been transported to this part of the world we now describe as South America. The Latin American ethnomusicologists, etc., tell me that there are vast problems with the word continent. And so the indigenous South American musicians had found a way to create new music that somehow melded some type of legitimate understanding of Baroque music with more local ways of thinking about musical creativity. Indeed, Geoff Baker's work on the role of music in colonial Cusco raises a number of fascinating questions. Not only were these Proto-European traditions warmly embraced by the indigenous Andeans, but on a much wider scale than had previously been understood. Indigenous musicians did find a certain sense of agency with this music, sufficient to be able to reinvent it on their own terms. So my suspicion was correct in that regard. But I completely failed to think about the fact that the only way this music could have become so deeply embedded in those communities and in those geographical locations was through the mechanisms afforded by the colonial enterprise. And so the agency, the musical and epistemic agency, understood and realized by these indigenous musicians included affordances of power and other forms of status and privilege in these colonial sociocultural ecologies. At the time, back in the day, I was one of many BAME persons who sincerely believed that assimilationism was a good thing. I had not taken this way of living to constitute the erasure of my Black identity, and it has taken the death of George Perry Floyd Jr. for me and many others to realize that Ibram Kendi is indeed correct to assert that however superior assimilationism may be deemed to segregationism, both are in fact racist. Unlike Carola Simani, I cannot resist colonialism by reverting to a native language because my native language is a colonial language. But many of the musical traditions in my cultural inheritance could be understood as constituting resistance to imperialism. And as such, I would now like to suggest that there is a very special way in which the work of anti-colonialism is more easily achieved in music than it is in language. Now, in some ways, it feels like I am only now getting started on the discussion I had first envisaged when I constructed this proposal. And I cannot believe how much work I have done that has found absolutely no place in this presentation. This early music world is every bit as vast as I had understood from a distance. And the more I have learned, the more I've understood how little I know. I don't think I have ever spoken in a conference environment in which I have felt so inexpert. And it has also been a sobering experience to realize that the more my collection of weighty academic texts on the Baroque era grows, the further I get from the music itself. Now, I am understanding that it is really not easy to actually get hold of some of these more obscure scores for vast amounts of this repertoire. And this is a real shame because maybe if Baroque performing enterprises would become more interested in representing a much wider range of Baroque musical practices, this might prospectively result in a wider demographic of audience members who become increasingly interested in this music. However, for me personally, performing the music of Bach, Handel, and Telemann is the antithesis of hoping to secure more cultural capital for myself in this society. And this is another conversation. I very much hope to have the opportunity to present to an early music research forum some of my ideas regarding the ways in which Protestant theology, as espoused in Baroque sacred music, actually speaks directly to the concerns of oppressed people in many different contexts, and in ways that appear not to have been transported to the 19th century and beyond. But I will try to encapsulate some of what I am pointing at by playing a short excerpt from one of the best choruses from Handel's Messiah that has been comprehensively reimagined in the context of what the British theologian and activist Robert Beckford has characterized as a gospel of liberation, as opposed to simply a gospel of welfare. I will venture to suggest that the African Americans who performed this re-envisioned chorus have in fact gotten much closer to what Jennens, the librettist, and Handel, the composer, had in mind than the vast majority of choral ensembles, both professional and otherwise, who perform this work year in and year out. Most have absolutely no idea why the sons of Levi were to be purified, but the sheer brilliance of Handel's writing enables one to hide in the music itself, if one so chooses. As I considered what my African American brethren achieved with this and all the other reimagined movements from Messiah that appear on this 1992 Warner release, when I then went back to Handel's original, I could not hear any of his music in the same way as before. Which means that I no longer believe that it is imperative that I conduct the original score of Messiah in a way that celebrates the very specific forms of whiteness that are taken to be emblematic of authentic historical performance practice of this music. Now, one need not go to the opposite extreme and enforce an in-your-face gospel choral aesthetic on Handel's music just to assert Black identity. What I am saying is that it is entirely possible for someone like me to utilize an approach to balance, blend, and color across both instruments and voices in order to positively create new vocal and instrumental colors, different approaches to phrasing that represent different ways of thinking theologically and anthropologically about the text, and different ways of celebrating one's own BAME identity that correspond to Sarah Ahmed's hugely important postulate that whiteness is in fact a verb as well as a noun. There is a long way to go before this can become a viable enterprise. But at the moment, we recognize that Baroque music has real potential to be part of anti-colonialism. We discover that this music has extraordinary power to reach people all over the world. Those who know of my previous career as a jazz pianist, well, I've not actually retired, but that's another conversation, may be surprised to learn that there is not a piano in my house now, but a harpsichord. I have so much to learn about how to tune and maintain this instrument, but I have slowly begun the journey to becoming a keyboard continuo player, and I am excited about the possibilities of being able to make much more use of my jazz and gospel musical vocabulary in my figured bass realizations than I might ever have thought possible before the death of George Floyd. It is sad that we cannot go together for a drink at this conference, because that is where I would tell you the story of what happened when I once got lost playing organ continuo in a recit in a Grabner cantata and ended up improvising my way to the end using harmonic colors rather closer to the Black church than the German Reformation tradition. But I am saying no more about that, as I do not want to scare off all you nice Baroque music people. Seriously, thank you very much.